Well, I'd say that, yes, Ireland has changed since 2002, partly as a result, of course, of increased wages. But, I mean, Rob gave gave a definition of competitiveness from Michael Storper, which is one that I've used as well. And competitiveness is defined, as the raising of living standards for your population, shall we say, within a given area. So, becoming competitive would naturally lead, therefore, to increased wages. And increased wages, I wouldn't say have been as much a problem in terms of our place as the most globalized economy. What has been more problematic has been what was a very narrow escape in terms of the Lisbon referendum. There has been policy changes as well in terms of trade. There has been less international investment of the type that we got before 2002, which was very much jobs orientated, whereas now we're very much focused on higher end services orientated operations. So I think all these are kind of, it's all dynamic anyway, and that these things were always foreseen to go and reach a height and fall down as other parts have picked up. So we were very competitive in manufacturing up to 2002, but that has been replaced now by services because of the nature, as you say, the cost base of our economy. It's too drawing down. Yeah. I don't know. I can only speak to in terms of my own personal opinion here. Is that we're a highly politicized little country that has very supposedly good representation at a very local level. How much of that is needed? I don't know. How detrimental the kind of parish politics is to a greater kind of national agenda, I don't know.
Okay, well, just before I'm going to take another question, and we might come back then for a comment. Robert, we might get you to give us your perceptions on competitiveness in the Irish economy and how you see it from Wales. But first of all, Dermot McCahey, board member of the Western Development Commission.
Thank you, Lisa. A question for Robert, if I might. Given the current economic downturn, which is obviously affecting many countries around the world, and in the context of what you spoke about in the UK, where you have different balances in terms of the regions, some doing better than others, what's the UK government perspective on the future in terms of regional development, in terms of trying to balance that out? Are they looking at sort of more centralising of things? Because obviously, well, I'm presuming the public purse in the UK is also under pressure, as it is here. And while there is this sort of imbalance, you've got the southeast doing very well, and some of the regions not doing so well. What's the sort of government thinking in terms of how to balance that out? Because again, if that imbalance goes further, then obviously you're going to end up with black spots and so on. So just maybe you could give a comment on what the UK government position is on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we first saw the recession and there was all the talk about the fallout from the financial crisis, there was feeling maybe there would be an inevitable sort of balancing out with a lot of job loss maybe around London and the greater southeast. And we saw this initially, but then there's a lot of knock-on effects, and the regions have suffered equally, if not worse, than London. In terms of UK policy, it seems to be more or less business as usual, to my mind. And it is this idea that the greater southeast, these hot spots around London, Oxford and Cambridge will act as the key pillars in terms of what I call, and as Pat said, the sort of high road of competitiveness, where it is around innovation rather than around cost-based competition. Obviously, as I mentioned in the presentation, we see some resources going to cities, we see some going to Birmingham, Manchester, etc. But it's complex in a way because of the fact that we've gone through now some form of devolution in Wales as well, devolution in the UK. So regions, they all now have their own regional development agencies across England, and they have some autonomy there in terms of responsibility for development. Within Wales, when Wales now has its own assembly, its own government to some extent, this goes back to the previous comment, where Wales has emulated Ireland to some extent, in that since we've had the evolution, we've seen a complete bloating of the public sector, and in particular with the number of civil servants, etc. And I think the data shows that now, in terms of the split between public and private sector workers across all UK regions, Wales has the highest number, highest proportion of public sector workers compared to the private sector, with the exception of Northern Ireland. And I think there's some data which show it's almost a 50-50 split, or actually not far off in Northern Ireland. But I think Wales is second in those rankings. But in terms of policy, and I've been in London in particular, now we have partial devolution. It seems to have given central government in the UK around Whitehall and around Westminster even more of a rationale in their minds to just concentrate around these hotspots and to hope we're going to get this trickle-down model. And I've been to some presentations, and even where central government, UK government, still has authority in these areas in terms of economic policy for the regions and for Wales and Scotland, we don't get a look in. And I think there's now really a sort of fuzzy form of devolution between regional devolution and central policy. And until that's ironed out, I think it's going to be quite difficult for some of these lagging regions to actually catch up at all.
Could I do that bit before the middle?
Yeah, a follow-on question. And are there any other questions? We've 3 here as well. Okay, 4. Okay.
Just in terms of the political parties then in the UK, current government, and the possible change, let us say, is there a different policy position between the current government and the Conservatives in terms of regional development, or are they both sort of singing up the same hymn sheet on that?
Well, it's interesting. Despite what I say about the centralisation of policy at the moment, Labour government actually did bring in the regional development agencies to England. Now, I'm not sure whether it's written down or not, but from what I've been told is that the Conservatives, the Tories, their manifesto would probably say they're actually going to scrap the regional development agencies. Now, whether that would lead to even more centralisation, I'm not sure. What they're saying, I think, is that they're quite taken with this city-region concept. So actually maybe, and it's all around boundaries, isn't it? It's all around boundaries of space in terms of planning. And they would say they would have, maybe the Greater Manchester region given more power than maybe what is there now within giving the North West Regional Development Agency. But it seems to me it's all about political change for political change. We had trading enterprise councils within the UK for a number of years. They were just finding their feet. And then they were scrapped to be replaced by RDAs. And now they talk about going back to something with a tech model. I think what we need is some policy patience. And I think that is a problem in terms of, when I do economic development, we just sort of, I said, a pact around this political expediency of just change for change's sake. We see it in Wales. Wales was, within the assembly as it is, was mainly Labour. They had a policy. One of the things in Wales is we have no public sector research establishments. So all the onus in terms of innovation is placed on the universities. So an idea would be all the public sector research establishments are all around the southeast. Well, you've got some money now, why not think about developing maybe a food centre for Wales? It doesn't exist. The Labour government in Wales said, we're not going to have these. No one builds public sector research establishments anymore. The last time they had an election is now a coalition government between Labour and Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalists. That's now given a change in policy. Now we're going to set up, apparently, public sector research establishments. And they said this 2 years ago. I put a question in, where's the development? They're going to be based on universities. Well, I think we need more than just relying on universities to build a more competitive economy.
Okay. Now, I'm going to take those 4 questions, and if we could just have them and we'll group them, and then we'll ask our 2 speakers to respond to those before we close the session. So again, and if you'd like to give your name and organisation, that's fine. It's optional if you'd like to.
Name is Linda Shulbury, Independent. I have a question that's either for Patrick or Robert. Is there any example of the city, in terms of the vision you have for Galway City, in terms of creativity and becoming a creative hub? Is there any example of a city or area across the globe that you would say that's a good example? And then my second part of that question, is there something that we need to be doing, whether it's through our education system or through the agencies that we have, that will drive out the creative ideas in people, because although the world has gone flat and we've spikes, a lot of it has come from pure technology, and there's a lot of ingenuity that's in people that kind of gets shafted because they get forced into the economic side of the world. Is there something there that you think should be happening? And because a lot of cities, and particularly in the developing world, they think the way to reach prosperity is to emulate the West. The Latin Quarter was a good example. I thought of that. I mean, I don't know where that came from.
Okay, just going to hold that question. And can I take the other questions as well? Sorry, the gentleman next.
I'm also kind. I was particularly struck with Dr. Patrick's comment. I have a little difficulty with the circle 15 miles west of Galway, because I see it as more as a little straight line over there. Anyway, maybe it has some relevance, my point, in Wales, because I'm just dealing with creativity from a cultural point of view. And of course, we're different in Ireland and Wales from the chief cultural thing, because Ireland, our first language is Irish, and of course in Wales your first language is English. But at the end of the day, we end up having this cultural thing that we're trying to create, and then link a lot of industries and so on. And I was at a funeral recently in Dublin where I met a guy who worked for the minister, and I think he got moved sideways. And he said something very interesting to me. He said, down here in Galway you have the Ballynahown syndrome. Well, what he meant was, he's a keen advocate of the Irish language and the Irish being a TG car, but he just kind of focused in on the fact that that the weather concentrated first in Ballynahown, the principal news of the day was Ballynahown. It seemed that there was an insularity in the entire issue of what the cultural thing was doing. And creativity is much wider because it's in everybody. And it shouldn't be kind of put into single or just region. It should spread out.
Okay.
So I like his direction he's going, because I'm obviously looking very deep, but I think it has a lot of relevance for us going forward. You know?
Okay, thank you for that. And just a final question we'll take before we
my name is Rob Diaz. I teach in the art department in GMIT, the college. My question really is about Bohemian arts and to Robert, the role of Bohemian arts in developing rural competitiveness. How you see that the role of painters and printmakers and ceramists and people, what role the development of those industries in this area would have.
Okay. Okay, so just those questions to both of you. Examples of cities, creativities around the globe, and what do we need to be doing, the agencies and the players here to harness those creative ideas. And the following question, just here with the gentleman on the Bohemian arts and the role of it. And I'm going to add one final one, particularly from the UK experience, Robert. As you know, there's a call for to develop a national strategy to develop the creative sector. And just what advice or pointers would you give to us here in Ireland, and particularly of relevance to the Western region, which is a largely rural region, in developing any kind of national strategy for developing the creative sector? So, and if you could possibly keep your comments as brief as possible as we're coming to the close of this session.
There are examples all across. Lots of cities like the site themselves as examples, be it Barcelona or be it Bilbao, and that's what the whole European, capital culture thing was about. But obviously we saw work that doesn't necessarily make best practice by just labelling it as such. Secondly, with regards to the education point, we had the Ballad Dream conference a couple of weeks ago, which was hosted by the West Development Commission and Roscommon County Council, where this came up again and again and again. That really, at secondary level, if not primary level, we are educating, the youth wrongly in terms of creativity. We are making them choose between science or arts, and science or, should we say, more social-based subjects. And we are, even in universities, there's huge distinctions between those. Whereas the reality, in terms of kind of getting that kind of creative ethos out there, really has to be about breaking down those boundaries in particular.
Robert, final comments on those questions?
Yeah, I think with the issue about education, it reminds me a lot about within universities now about the idea of entrepreneurship education. I think, as you said, creativity is sort of implicit in everybody. I think it needs to be within the agenda overall in terms of development. It's interesting that Pat, when he made his comment when he was talking, said about the commodification of creativity. I can see it, but maybe creativity has always been commodified to some extent. You think about artists from hundreds of years ago, they all had their benefactors. They wouldn't have been able to do what they wanted to do unless there was some kind of commodification. They were turning out paintings for their families, etc. In terms of, I think, their strategy, and it won't surprise you given my presentation, I think is to make sure that it is inclusive. I think if you do look at other strategies, they have been very city-based, and I hope you'll see the spillover. I think we need to see more. Certainly, if I was involved in any sort of strategy, to look at the links between some of the urban characteristics and more of the rural characteristics in terms of development, and that might lead you in the end to a different definition of creative industries and a creative class than the one that we currently work with, which I do think has an implicit urban bias in its making.
Okay, well, I think that's a very good note for us to end this session, and just to thank once again Professor Robert Huggins from Cardiff School of Management, University of Wales Institute, and Director of Centre for International Competitiveness, for sharing those insights from the UK, and to Dr. Patrick Collins here at the Centre for Innovation and Structural Change in Galway for sharing his insights with us as well. Thank you for your attention.